Well, good morning. My name is Ryan Bohl. I'm a senior Middle East North Africa analyst with the RAIN Network. I'm here with Charlie, one of our threat lens analysts, and we are talking about the invasion of Gaza that is now looming and the war between Israel and Hamas. And I think maybe it makes some sense for us to kind of give us a placeholder of where events are this morning, and we are continuing to monitor events as they unfold. But what we're seeing right now is a substantial military buildup by the Israelis, about 300,000 reservists, one of the largest call-ups of military reservists in Israel's history in response to the October 7th Hamas assault into southern Israel. And the casualties so far are around almost 1,400 Israelis, and I think about 15 to 1,800 Palestinians so far have been killed in the fighting. And so we are watching for the looming ground invasion, which we now believe is imminent because the Israeli army has ordered about 1 million Gazans to evacuate to the south from Gaza City in the north part of the Strip. And this suggests to us that an Israeli ground invasion is on its way, and that their first phase of their operation will be in the north of the Strip rather than across the whole Strip. And we also know that the Israeli government's political objectives and strategic objectives are the complete dismantling of Hamas and its infrastructure. And what that means is a full-scale invasion that will potentially last quite a long time in order to ensure that Hamas is not able to reconstitute or retake territory. Let's start to kind of break through some of the theaters. And Charlie, do you want to talk about what we're seeing in the West Bank so far?
Sure. In the West Bank so far, we've seen increasing settler violence. Well, we've seen increasing settler violence for a long time, but we saw some significant settler attacks over the last 36 to 48 hours. There was an attack outside Nablus by armed Israeli settlers, in which 3 Palestinians were reportedly killed. That was on October 11th. On October 12th, we saw a follow-on attack by settlers on the funeral of those who were involved in the earlier attack, and that killed an additional 2 Palestinians. We've also seen widespread arrests in across the West Bank by Israeli troops. They're targeting militants. There's also a fairly persistent threat. I haven't seen anything specific off the top of my head, but there are probably going to be a lot of Palestinian militant attacks in the coming days. As part of the events in Gaza as solidarity. So the West Bank is pretty heightened. It was heightened tensions before October 7th, and the October 7th attacks have only increased where we're at in the West Bank.
And we will respond to questions and comments as best we can in case anybody is interested. We do have one here talking about the angle of Iran, and I'm not sure exactly if you're asking about necessarily the role of Iran, but here's what we know about Iran's role. We know, of course, that the Iranians have provided military and economic support to Hamas as well as Hezbollah for many years. We also know that the relationship between Hamas and Iran is different than the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran. Hamas is not an easy, simple proxy of the Iranians. They don't necessarily take orders from the Iranians. They take advice and support. There is a sectarian difference between the two. Hamas is Sunni. Iran's government is Shia. That actually was a significant difference during the Syrian civil war when Hamas backed the rebels trying to overthrow the Syrian government, whereas Iran sent in forces to back the Syrian government. And the two of them actually spent a better part of the last decade with very strained relations. In spite of their mutual antipathy of Israel, they weren't always getting along. And since the normalization of Syria began, a couple of years ago, relations between Hamas and Iran have improved. Now, there's been some reporting out there that suggests that Iran played an active role in planning these attacks. We don't think that that's confirmed yet. We'd like to see more evidence. What we do know is that Iran had an incentive to support a potential Hamas attack on southern Israel. So acting as an enabler rather than as a director. And those are two different things because they will create the politics of the response. If Iran simply supported Hamas in this attack by providing them materials and providing them training, that is different from the Israeli government's eyes than directly ordering the attack. And so the Israelis will be disincentivized to carry out expansive retaliation against the Iranians. And that limits our escalation scenario in which Israel and Iran go directly to war. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it at the moment, is that we are also, of course, watching for Iran's direction of Hezbollah and its use of its proxies and forces within Syria. And the Iranians right now do not have a strong incentive to carry out a mass retaliation or mass escalation against the Israel. If they do so, if they decided to make that choice, it would damage their relations with the Saudis, which are somewhat improving. It could potentially alienate the Chinese because it could result in an energy shock that would harm China's economy. It could cause domestic unrest within Iran, where the government is always struggling with legitimacy, and it could involve an intervention by the United States that brings Iran into a conflict that it has worked very hard to avoid over the years. But that being said, when the Gazan invasion begins, the Iranians and Hezbollah will both have a very strong political imperative to come up with some kind of a response. And our baseline right now is thinking about the idea, the idea of limited escalation, that is symbolic attacks on Israeli army posts along the Golan Heights and the Syrian and the Lebanese Israeli border. That would keep the retaliation in that area of symbolism where they still cause damage to the IDF, distract them from their invasion of Gaza without causing the Israeli government to be put into a policy box where they have to retaliate at scale against both Syria and Lebanon and Iran itself. Um, so there's also a question about the manufacturing of missiles for used in the attack. So Hezbollah's missile arsenal, a lot of it is indigenous. It's made out of dual use components. That is, it's civilian gear that they then turn into missiles. And that's, of course, a function of the long-standing Israeli blockade on Gaza. Hamas has had to become very
Mhm.
inventive in how they use these missiles and what they develop from them. They have gotten, of course, Iranian Revolutionary Guard know-how. The Iranians are very good at
Mhm.
using dual use technologies that they get out of the West. And they have given that knowledge to Hamas so that they can take things like civilian components and then turn those into longer range missiles. And that's an escalation that we've also seen, of course, in Ukraine, where a lot of dual use Western technology has ended up being used with Iran's Shahed drones that have ended up in Russian hands. So the Hamas has a lot of sources for its missile arsenal and has developed these factories to build them. If there is a Chinese link to it, it's probably more likely to be incidental. That is, it's Chinese civilian
Mhm.
equipment, as opposed to Beijing directly trying to supply missiles to a group like Hamas.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, we might see occasional, with the, from what I've seen, Hamas hasn't been big on drones, but we'll likely see some use of DJI Mavic drones or other Chinese equipment. That is just happenstance because it's where they can source it. It's not the China supporting anything. It's just a matter of they're a good source for inexpensive equipment that can be readily adapted to combat use.
Right. And I guess we could talk about some of the wider implications that we're already seeing. We've just gotten a report from Reuters that the Saudis are going to freeze normalization with Israel, which was expected during this time period. Our baseline remains that we still expect Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize eventually, but this conflict will obviously freeze that for however long the war goes on. And then it depends on the humanitarian impacts. And that's something else that we're watching for because that too could be geopolitically significant. There are about 2 to 2.5 million Gazans that live in the Strip. The Israelis intend on destroying Hamas's infrastructure, which is deeply embedded within the civilian architecture of that strip. That means that the Israelis are not only going to have to go house to house and door to door and dig out these tunnels, they may have to destroy significant amounts of civilian infrastructure to dismantle Hamas's capabilities, and that will almost certainly cause a refugee flood to cause people to rush out of the way, and that becomes Egypt's problem, right? Right, Charlie. We've been tracking
Yep, yep.
Egyptians' responses. Can you explain a little bit about the Egyptian?
So the Egyptians are very intent on not allowing Gazans to escape to Egypt. They don't want a refugee crisis. At the same time, they also don't necessarily want to be seen as a wholly an Israeli enabler of a massive civilian death toll in Gaza. So they're in a bit of a difficult political position. And in terms of a security position, the Israelis have already bombed the Rafah crossing at least once. It sounds like multiple times. So there is a chances of escalation along the Egyptian frontier, especially as the Israelis push southwards towards Rafah, into Gaza. So there are a couple things that and there's obviously a major disconnect in Egypt between the government and the people. Obviously, the population tends more pro-Palestinian, but the government is firmly in a pro-Israel, or maybe not pro-Israel, but a firmly, a more firm ally of Israel, I should say. in terms of intelligence and other issues. So there's a disconnect in terms of, so there's the immediate implications of a major refugee flow from Gaza into northern Egypt, which the Egyptians are trying to avoid by stationing troops and other and tanks and armored vehicles. But it's fundamentally hard for Gazans to evacuate given given the situation that they're at. So, and obviously, major civilian death toll in Gaza could cause a popular backlash against the Egyptian government that they're also trying to avoid. So there's a lot of moving parts with the on the Egyptian side of the border.
And of course, we haven't seen anything that suggests the Egyptian government is preparing to take in refugees just yet. What we have seen from the Egyptian government is that they clearly want to keep Gazans within Gaza. They are concerned that if refugees come into the Sinai, they may never go back. That is the pattern of conflict within this region. Is once Palestinians leave a location, they typically aren't allowed back in. Now, of course, the Gaza Strip is technically Palestinian territory under the Oslo Accords, but nevertheless, that assumption is factoring into Egypt's thinking. We don't yet see anybody offering to stand in and help the Egyptians absorb this refugee flow. If, for example, the Emiratis or the Saudis rolled up with a substantial aid package for Egypt, the Egyptians might be more open to allowing refugees into that territory. Also, the idea of the Egyptian government, we have a question here about Egyptian government. Is it able to withstand this domestic backlash? And the answer is, for the short term, yes. I think that, yes, the Sisi government has a very strong security apparatus and military force. Many people are loyal to the regime. And we saw the crush, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood back in the 2010s after the Arab Spring when Sisi ascended to power. So they have all the hard tools that they need. This is an incredibly tricky and difficult position for the Egyptian government to be in politically, however, because now it involves the Israelis. There is an Egyptian presidential election in December, which we expect Sisi to win. But there's nevertheless a great deal of discontent within Egypt because of the government's longstanding oppression, the economic conditions, which are very dire there. And now this whole repeat of history, so to speak, of watching Palestinians being potentially displaced permanently again is going to inflame popular sentiment. And Egypt will be very unstable and a high risk place to both live and work for a while as Cairo tries to manage this descent. It remains possible that this will cause a resurgence in sympathy for the Muslim Brotherhood and or radicalize militants in the Sinai. And they may decide that groups like ISIS in the Sinai could start to attack locations like the Suez Canal, attack tourists throughout Egypt. All of that is in the cards at this moment. And in fact, from a global perspective, well, Charlie, you want to talk about the global perspective, what we kind of expect jihadists to do?
Sure, I can tell you kind of briefly what we expect. The Al Qaeda, so Al Qaeda has been very vocal in support of the Palestinian cause following the October 7 attack. They've been very much trying to jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, of the pro-Palestinian on the pro-Palestinian bandwagon, so to speak. AQAP has issued statements. Al-Shabaab has issued statements. Al-Qaeda Central, interestingly, is not, but I would expect them to eventually issue something. I expect at least they're going to try and take advantage of this to rebuild their street cred, so to speak, in the Islamist community. Islamic State has been more quiet on the issue. They issued an editorial in Naba, which this morning, which is their official magazine, in which they discuss Gaza, or at least they refer to Gaza, but they don't expressly. They refer to it as one among many issues for the jihadist community, or so as rather than the big issue. And Islamic State has been a little bit more. Israel hasn't been their main focus, with the exception of Islamic State Sinai has been kind of the exception to that, given their close proximity to Israel. But obviously, Islamic State's relationship to the Palestinian issue has kind of ebbed and flowed over time. When Baghdadi and Zarqawi were in charge, they tended to put the Palestinian issue a little bit higher of a priority. Under more recent leadership, it's been more focusing on Iraq, Syria, and other theaters. That being said, and I do need to note this, in 2022, there were a couple of attacks by Israeli Arab Islamic State supporters. In one case, one was actually claimed by the Islamic State. So the issue of Israel is still in their wheelhouse. It's just not as high of a priority as it is for Al Qaeda. So
Although I expect that we will see that change as this continues to
yep,
unfold.
yep, I fully expect that as well.
And in fact, the Palestinian issue in general has been neglected geopolitically and diplomatically for a long time, in part because it seems insoluble. And other issues like Ukraine, COVID, nationalist populism in a lot of countries kind of subsumed the Palestinian question in a kind of the lower priority of both global diplomatic efforts and regional diplomatic efforts. This is why countries like the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco normalized with Israel, is because they believed that the Palestinian issue was no longer central to a lot of their domestic audiences' concerns. And I think we're about to see that change in a notable way. There's another question here about where could these more than 1 million people go? And the short answer is they will go to the south near the Egyptian border, where they will not have access to necessarily substantial amounts of food and fuel and water. That will be a real threat to them as they evacuate southwards. And then the other problem is that once the Israelis have cleared out the northern part of the strip, what happens to them as the Israeli army pushes south? Do the Israelis intend on allowing civilians to return to what will almost certainly be bombed out and rebel-strewn cities? Will Israel take responsibility for the aid programs that are necessary for them? Or are the Israelis going to work with the Gulf Arabs? Are they going to work with the Egyptians to try to push people into Egypt? And we don't know yet. That is an imperative the Israelis will have to face.
One thing politically, I kind of want to throw this to you, Ryan. It's kind of a hardball. Hamas is both a governing force and a militant group in the Gaza Strip. And there's really no way Israel can militarily destroy Hamas without ultimately affecting the ability of anyone to govern the Gaza Strip. So how do you see the future of governance in the Gaza Strip after, like, what are the scenarios that we're foreseeing there in terms of a political standpoint? Are the Israelis going to have to occupy the Gaza Strip long term? Are there other groups they could kind of put in as proxies? Is there enough PA interest in governing the strip? Like, what do we see the future of Gaza looking like after the dust settles?
Yeah, and that's a key part of this, right? Is that a few weeks ago, only the far right, the farthest of the far right, believed in reoccupying Gaza in order to end the rocket fire. It's been a fringe policy issue for a lot of far right Israeli politicians for a long time, and some center right people as well. Avigdor Lieberman has long said that they should reoccupy the Gaza Strip. Many Israelis consider the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 to be a disaster, and now that is more or less the consensus, is that the abandoning of the strip in 2005 resulted in Hamas's rise, which resulted in this attack. So Israel is going to go in and dismantle Hamas as a governing entity, and then it needs a governing solution, of which it has very few good options. They can reoccupy the strip militarily and bring in their occupation authority of Kogat, which administers the regions that Israel administers in the West Bank. They can also attempt to do what they've done in the West Bank, in which Kogat monitors certain parts of the strip, while the Palestinian Authority monitors others. That would be a governing solution that is far from perfect. It would require the Israelis to commit themselves to an extended campaign of basically fighting an insurgency within Gaza. And then the third and final one is more or less depopulation, is to push Palestinians out of the strip at scale to the point where there really isn't a Palestinian community that needs to be governed in the aftermath. Again, that requires Egypt to open their borders, which we don't see happening in the near term. But that is something that some Israeli far-right politicians and some right-wing politicians are talking about, is that the solution to the Gaza Strip's challenge is to end the Gaza Strip as an independent community from a Palestinian nationalism standpoint. So that is also in the cards. It could end up happening incidentally. We've obviously seen a lot of brutal sieges over the past 10 years. The Battle of Aleppo resulted in depopulation in Syria. The Battle of Mariupol between Russia and Ukraine resulted in the depopulation of Mariupol and has allowed the Russians to bring in Russian people to recolonize or to resettle in that Ukrainian city. That is, unfortunately, as we watch the development of the multipolar world is much more violent and brutal in a way that I think a lot of us are not used to seeing. Most of us were raised 90s, 2000s, etc. And when we are used to a certain dynamic that is coming to an end, and we're returning to some of the more brutal standards of war that we saw in the 1930s and before that, in which population transfers were a normal tactic. And we're also seeing that in other places like Azerbaijan with Nagorno-Karabakh, where they're steadily depopulating that area. We've seen the Turks try to depopulate areas of Syria that have Kurds, and of course the Russians in Ukraine. So it's an unfortunately increasingly common tactic that the Israelis will be tempted to use in the course of this war. Another question here about can we expect attacks on the Suez Canal? Charlie, do you want to take that one?
As far as expecting attacks on the Suez Canal, they're certainly within the realm of possibility. Islamic State Sinai Peninsula has become less active in recent years, but they have become more. They've been able to operate over a wider area in recent years, and obviously the threat is still there. Their patterns recently, in past years at least, they've tended to increase their attacks around the November-December timeframe, so we could see another escalation like that. More importantly, we could also see an escalation in response to the situation in Gaza. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? Not at this point, simply because Egyptian security forces are really focused on securing the canal. But as the situation develops and as the fighting in Gaza goes on, and if jihadists get more of a foothold in Egypt again, we could see attacks on the canal. Yes.
Okay. That we got another question here about Turkey. Any chance of Erdogan getting involved? And that was a question we were wrestling with this morning in our morning briefing. Turkey's position is obviously very pro-Palestinian, but Turkey also has a treaty relationship with Israel that goes back to the 40s. Their relationship goes through strains and breaks, and then it comes back to its natural position because, in part, they don't share a land border, of course, and Turks are also not Arabs, which means that there's less of an ethnic dimension to the solidarity movement. Erdogan's primary position right now will be twofold. First is to gain domestic political points by criticizing Israel, which costs him nothing and won't alienate the United States. We should remember Turkey's geopolitical position. They are currently holding up a yes vote for Sweden's accession to the NATO alliance, which is all related to Ukraine. This is how complicated the map has gotten. So the United States will be reticent to push back on Turkey if they criticize Israel because Turkey has that leverage at this moment. So we know that there will be a political response and a diplomatic response. Erdogan, on the other hand, in the longer run, the Turkish government in the longer run, they are, of course, cash-strapped. They had massive earthquakes earlier this year, which causes substantial damage to their gross domestic product and still requires a very large reconstruction bill itself. So they're not likely to provide much more than symbolic aid for Palestinians. But in the longer run, it depends on what happens to the Gaza Strip. What's the final solution there? If we see depopulation, Turkey's relations with Israel will likely be strained for a very long time, and it could result in Turkey trying to become a sponsor of Palestinians in exile, of trying to bring in Palestinians even to Turkey itself in order to show solidarity. We could see a change like that. On the other hand, of course, there is that real complication that Turkey and Israel are implicit allies in Azerbaijan, where we are watching the Azeris carry out their campaign against the Armenians and are actually threatening to begin another war where they might link their enclave in the Caucasus to the main part of Azerbaijan. Israel provides Azerbaijan with most of its military equipment. Some of its best military equipment and drones are from Azerbaijan, and so does Turkey. And so they are on the same side in a place where Turkey has greater geopolitical imperatives. Turkey wants to have influence and to roll back Russian power within the Caucasus. That's an ancient one imperative of the Turks. And in that sense, the Palestinians may not be worth sacrificing that relationship. And Turkey is also very interested in getting natural gas from Israel. So there's a lot of constraints to Turkey being able to escalate against the Israelis beyond symbolism. They may, and this is more speculation on our part, but they may decide to hold up Sweden's yes vote unless they can get concessions from NATO that's more critical of Israel. That's a possibility in the coming weeks that they decide to hold up NATO yet again to the expansion of the alliance to try to convince European capitals and the U.S. to be harder on Israel. So that is a possibility. And of course, we've seen them do that before for their own domestic political purposes. And the other thing is that Sweden is not a threat of a Russian invasion. And so holding them out of the alliance doesn't really change the strategic imperatives of NATO at the moment. Sweden is a nice to have, not a must have. And Turkey knows that. We've got another question here about what is the strategic or tactical significance of the U.S. Navy being in the region. Charlie, you want to take a start with that one?
Yeah, sure. The primary purpose of the U.S. Navy being in the region is to deter Iranian activity in response to the Gaza attack. We've sent the aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is the newest carrier in the U.S. fleet, to act as a deterrent against Iranian aggression in the region. We're also sending another carrier strike group. I can't remember which one, but we are sending at least 2 strike groups to the region. And then also, as far as the other objective is to also deter Hezbollah as part of that. So the U.S. has signaled to Hezbollah that that they should not get involved in fairly no uncertain terms to say. So that is the purpose. It's also probably there, to be honest, as part of a contingency should non-combatant evacuation operations be required in any country in the region as a result of what's going on in Gaza. And so there, or 1,000 other possible contingencies. There are also reports of U.S. Special Operations personnel maybe not in Israel, but in the region, also on standby for potential contingency operations. Part of that is there are 150 hostages in Gaza, among them a number of Americans. And it's unclear. Obviously, I think it's more likely the Israelis will take the lead on any hostage rescue, but the U.S. will probably be involved in an advisory capacity, at least.
Yeah, and as Charlie said, deterrence is, of course, their primary mission, and humanitarian aid as they might be able to provide. But some of the geostrategic significance of this is, of course, that the USS Gerald Ford by itself is more powerful than the entire Iranian Air Force, and that is the point of deploying a battle platform like that, is to suggest to the Iranians and to Hezbollah that the United States may carry out airstrikes against the locations of strikes against Israel. So, and I think it's important to kind of remember some of our history of the last time there was such regional tension in the 1990s during the Gulf War, and Saddam Hussein launched missiles against Israel in order to create a distraction, in order to create divisions within the Arab coalition, and the U.S. is trying to signal that if such strikes were carried out against Israel, it would do what it did in the 1990s and basically go missile hunting. And it could potentially involve strikes on both Lebanon and on Iran itself. That's what they're trying to signal. But I think we could talk about some of the wider strategic imperatives of the U.S., which is that the U.S. wants out of the Middle East. It has been 22 years of wars there, which have not all been conclusive and certainly not all in favor of the United States. Russia has invaded Ukraine. China is threatening to invade Taiwan, and the United States cannot be everywhere all at once. And so the U.S. wants to establish deterrence against Iran, and that's why they're pushing for Saudi-Israeli normalization. They're not looking to resolve the Iranian conflict or the Iran's not always helpful role in the region. And so the U.S. position is that it hopes by this deployment of force, it will be able to keep the Gaza war in Gaza. And that's the Americans' objective, is to see that the war stays only in Gaza and let Israel, the Gulf Arabs, Lebanon, etc., deal with the fallout of this war, then allow the U.S. to redeploy forces elsewhere again. The U.S. really wants to get out of the Middle East and really wants to be able to have the freedom of force to respond to the great power challenges of China and Russia. And that leads to a longer, more interesting question we kind of wrote about yesterday about how the United States is going to respond to Israel's policies, which are arguably a main driver of this escalation from Hamas by creating the West Bank settlements and the longstanding blockade of Gaza. Whether or not the U.S. decides to start pressing on the Israeli government to change its policies so that there are less likely to be wars that the United States could be dragged into when the U.S. is trying to leave.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we have any other questions from anybody else. This is a longer live than we normally do. We usually do quick ones for about 10 or so minutes. If anybody else has any other questions, we're more than happy to take them. Otherwise, we will continue to monitor this conflict. We've got the Rain Network website there, where we are publishing regularly situational reports. We are publishing assessments and long-term forecasts about what we expect, and of course, we are monitoring this situation, through our social media. Oh, got one more question here. We can take that one too. Is this an opportunity to break BRICS unity for the US? And I think the answer is probably not, because BRICS, first off, isn't all that united anyway. There's big divisions between India, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., on a strategic level. And for example, they're not even unified on their economic policies about whether or not they would want to adopt a common currency or not. There's very different opinions on that. Uh, on the other hand, this is a place where, depending on how escalated this gets and whether or not the United States has to intervene militarily, and whether or not that causes another energy shock, similar to what we saw after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that could cause the BRICS as an entity to emerge as a stronger alternative to the U.S.-led world order. So the places like India definitely want to see a de-escalation in Gaza, largely for humanitarian purposes and or because they're concerned about an energy shock that could be caused by regional escalation. So that kind of gives you an idea of how other countries are viewing this. Because again, up until about 7 days ago, Palestine was one of the lowest priorities geopolitically for most actors. And now it's being pulled back up, and all of these other countries have these evolving and developing interests in the multipolar world that are having interference run by the sudden resurgence of violence in that area. Right. I think we'll call it at 30 minutes then. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. I hope we answered them to your satisfaction. Again, our website, rainnetwork.com, stratfor.com also still works to get to the website where you can get up to 3 articles per month, part of the registration, and to see what our situational awareness updates are and our longer term assessments. We will certainly be talking about this topic more. So keep an eye on our social media feeds to see these updates.